This episode is brought to you by CodeSpaces. Check out codespaces.com for quality services on managing your coding projects. Also by Peepcode. Find excellent Ruby on Rails screencasts and mini-books at peepcode.com. Here I have a list of articles. And when you click on one, you get a full content view of that article. So this page of the article looks somewhat similar to the article listed in the index view. So when I see this commonality, I instantly think, hey, if we use a partial, we can remove the duplicate view code and clean the view up that way. So that's what I've done in the application, so we can see how well it works for us here. So here I've got the index page displaying multiple articles, and I'm just passing articles array to our partial. So it's for each of the articles there, it renders that partial, and I'm doing something similar in the show page, just passing one article to the partial to render that. And here's that partial. Now when I look at this, I think, wow, this is too complicated, much more complicated than it needs to be at least. What we've done is successfully removed all traces of duplicate code, but at the cost of readability. And to me, that's not a good enough reason. Sometimes duplicate code is acceptable as long as it's readable and maintainable too. So we've got this partial here, and the reason it's so complex is because it needs to handle the display of the article differently depending on what page is rendering that partial. So for example, here we have the link in the title, we have the comments link here, and we have this read more link with this displaying only part of the article, and on the full content article page we don't have those links. So all these little exceptions add up, and to when we have to render the partial, they're all different little conditions that make the partial much more complex than it really needs to be. And here you can see I'm using this current page method, which will actually compare the URL to the article to the current URL. And because it's doing an exact URL comparison, this has a little bit of a bad side effect in that if you do actually add a query condition here, then you get the display of the article as it would appear in the index because the URL doesn't match exactly to the URL of the article. So that's something to be aware of if you are using that current page method. Now there are ways around this method problem, but it's really not worth going into because this is an ugly solution anyway. Whenever you're trying to make the partial look differently, depending on what page is rendering it, really take a step back and rethink your approach. Now I do run into this problem quite frequently, so here's 3 different tips that you can go through and try to see which one works best for you. Now the first one I recommend is just moving all the code back into the view out of the partial, because this way you can take a step back and just find out where the duplicate code is exactly. So that's what I'm going to do here. Let's do a loop here with the articles, and in here I just want to render that same code here, and I can take a lot of this conditions out. I always want to render the link. I don't need that condition anymore. I'll always render the comments link, and I always just want to display the article description in the index page. And I can do something similar back here on the show page. I don't even need a link here anymore for the article name. We don't need the comments link, and we can just remove that condition as well. So taking a look at this is exactly what duplication we have between these two views, and for me that's really not all that much. Now the line I consider the most duplication here is right here, this by author, on time, and so on. And this line I can remove maybe by moving it into the model itself, maybe into a helper method, or even another partial just with this line in it. So there are ways to remove just this minor duplication. Oh, by the way, I forgot to make these instance variables here. There we go. All right, so that's one solution, is just to take out the partial altogether and see exactly what duplication you have and just go through that one step at a time. Now another solution is to use the partial as a layout, and this is new in Rails 2.0. I usually don't have much of a need for this, but there are certain situations where it works really well. And that is, back here, if you notice in our partial, we have this content section, and our content changes completely depending on what a page is rendering our partial. So what we can do here is, instead of displaying that, we can pass yield to this. And that way we can pass a block when we're rendering this partial as a layout and put whatever content we want inside there. So we just call render, and instead of partial, just call render layout and pass the name of the partial to render. And we also need to pass our object option here and a block with that content in here, just like this. Alright, we can do the same thing inside of our index. Just like that. Alright. We also want just display that. There we go. Okay, so this way, this content will be just put in line directly wherever we have yield in our partial. So that's the second tip that might help you solve this problem of having to display the content of the partial differently depending on what page you're on. The last tip I have for you is to use style sheets. So this may not be immediately obvious, but if you want your content to look differently depending on what page it's on, just always display the content and hide whatever you don't want using a style sheet specifically for that page. So for example, here we can always display our comments link, but we don't want it on our show page, so we can just add a custom style sheet here for our single article show page. And let me show you that style sheet really quick. I've already written it up. And what this does is it just sets display none for that comments link to hide that link for us when we're on that page. And that way, it's sometimes not the best solution, but other times it may work really well for you. So those are 3 different ways that I recommend taking a look at for handling a partial differently depending on what page is rendering that partial. There are some other solutions which I'm going to take a look at in future episodes, specifically regarding how helper methods can play a part into this problem. So I'll see you then. And one more thing I want to show you real quick here is a style sheet method. I think I've shown you it before, but I want to show you it again just in case you didn't get it. This is a custom helper method which I use pretty much in all of my applications. And in my application helper, I have the style sheet method here, which just renders a style sheet link in the content for head here. And that way I could just pass head for the application layout right here. And that way the content, the style sheets can be specified on whatever page you're on. Okay, that's just a few little tips there, and I'll see you next week.